Today's chore is to finish the flail mowing, and fortunately the tractor came through and bush hogged all the high stuff. You see the tractors down there. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead, and what we're doing here is we're returning the biomass to the soil to then get a cover crop in place to create additional biomass, which is just going to feed the soil. The cover crop that we have is going to have clover in it. It's going to have nitrogen fixing. It's going to really help build up this soil. But I'm also going to survey to make these terraces more level. So these terraces are fine if you're working them by hand, but even the BCS has some challenges with the terraces because of the slopes. And now we actually have an excavator on site that we can kind of clean these terraces up even better. We have a limited amount of time for the excavator, so I'm going to get it surveyed and then look for a future video where we're actually going to start digging the terraces. The concept for the terrace, and I'm a big advocate of terraces, is how do we get the most level surface area from a slope? So our initial design was kind of what's called a step terrace. So each terrace steps down a little bit as we move from the top of the slope to the bottom of the slope. Once you build out access points, such as the path that I'm walking on, and we're actually going to make the access points much wider so you can get equipment down. Once you have the access points in place, then you can start broadening your terraces. Now, when you broaden terraces, you move upslope. So the soil downslope will move upslope to make larger berms. You're going to have the same square footage on your vegetative strips as you would by stepping down. The difference is there'll be fewer terraces, so they should be easier to maintain. What we're looking for is these big level spaces like this, and of course like this, so that we can run equipment over, or appropriate equipment when we have it, but also so that we can have beds that are easier for volunteers to access. You can have a step terrace down a very steep slope. I've talked about it in many special reports about how to farm on slopes, but when you have outsiders that are not regularly interacting with the surface area or the layout, it can be a challenge. If this is overgrown and someone steps off of an embankment, even if it's 2 feet tall, they will hurt themselves, and then there's a liability for your farm. It's also an inconvenience, again, with the flail mower. I can flail mow 36 inches wide. If I have a terrace that's only 36 inches wide, then it's difficult to turn around. So we're adapting our design for functional use based on the equipment we have. However, if I'm just stepping down a couple terraces because I'm working it by hand, then the narrow terraces are better because it gives you faster access to the space. Can you understand what I'm talking about here? It's do what you can now to get started so that you can implement these other more advanced strategies as you have either the resources or the inclination. So these beds down on the bottom are pretty level. Then we have an access point, and then we have beds that are more of a slope. In order to level this out, we're going to have to do more than hand dig. And so the original slope we could do with by hand, and we could do with the rotary tiller. But these new slopes, we have to have bigger equipment. So you don't have to have the big equipment up front. You can get started with what you've got with narrow terraces. But as you move forward, you're going to want wider and wider terraces so that you can better manage the water. Now, the same principles apply. The bund, which is the lower shelf of the terrace, you can see one over here covered with hairy vetch. If it's a narrow bund, you may not be able to have trees on it. The trees and the vegetative strips provide habitat, windbreaks, a lot of value. So see the narrow path here and then trees on the bottom. Those are persimmon trees that are growing there. This narrow path is going to be more of an access point than a garden bed because, again, it's narrow, trees on either side. But if we turn around here and we have the vegetative strip on the bottom on the contour bund, which could be a swale or a mound, it's not meant to hold water, it's meant to hold back soil. If it's 4 foot wide across the top, then you can start having trees on it, and now you have both fruit and veg. You can have almost a food forest on a strip. But the level terraces will be easier to cultivate, easier to grow on, easier to maintain, and we still have the same vegetable materials from the vegetative strips because as we widen the terraces, the bunds or the mounds holding the terraces back can get taller. Now they also have to get thicker. So here we're only stepping up about a foot. And it's hard to see in the video, but this terrace is less than knee high and it goes back probably 8 feet, and at the most narrow, probably 4 feet. But if I was going to take this terrace back, 16 feet or 20 feet, I may need to raise this bund in order to support the water that will saturate the soil behind the mound. Your bunds are going to be built out of clay when possible. They're going to be compacted, but your growing spaces are not going to be compacted. So imagine a bunch of rain coming down. The rain will saturate the soil, and that saturated soil, that's a persimmon that I need to stake up. That saturated soil could become a mud or a slurry. It can hold a large amount of water. The water has a lot more weight than soil, and we don't want to have a mudslide. So that's why you'll start growing trees on the bunds. And look at this. I know that's a weed, but it's beautiful. And then so is the honey locust. But again, by getting these large strips planted in trees, you can actually start working steeper and steeper slopes. The top of this garden to the bottom of this garden is only a change in elevation of about 20 to 30 feet. The top of that bed to the bottom of that bed is probably only 10 feet. So again, we don't need infrastructure. We can get away with a nice little earth mound, but the earth mounds have to be properly maintained, meaning that you've got to cut the grasses and stuff on them to get to like a hairy vetch or ideally we'd like to get to a grass clover mixture on the slopes that's easy to maintain. But then that biomass comes off and goes around the plants. And then of course the wider beds will let you do different configurations of beds. So you can do keyhole beds, you can do long mound beds, you can use an automatic seeder, a push seeder, and you can do a much better volume. But I hope this is making sense to folks. A lot of my audience is just getting started, and sometimes they're afraid of going at a larger scale. So I want to show you in the majority of my videos how you can start with hand tools and work your way up to larger equipment, and that actually the design can cause less and less need for the equipment, so you can start renting equipment rather than buying it. You can start using cooperative equipment, meaning you don't have to own it. Part of your community can own it. And then you can start making better use of space. Like this particular space here is kind of an awkward space. We could turn this into like one big terrace and have this wider tree line down on the bottom. The wider tree line is going to give us an opportunity for fruit in the growing space, but the trees won't be tall enough to shade the garden in the summer. But we'll pick trees that lose their leaves in the winter so that you can get sun and extend your growing season. It is a complex function of design. However, you can understand it, you can use it. It does work consistently when done in phases. So if we came in here all at once with dump trucks and excavators and stuff, we would have spent a lot up front and not gotten those years of value. The work would be done, it would be a good investment, but it may impose a design on the land that the land doesn't want, and then we end up with wet spots and mudslides or erosion factors, where what we're doing here gives us an incremental approach into the property that we're really getting. The land is expressing itself. We didn't plant these persimmons, they grew themselves. It's an expression of the land and what was previously here. And then we actually found persimmons and cherries and other plants in the wood line over there. There probably was an orchard here at one time. We're letting those plants express themselves. And then even in all the weeds that we allowed to grow up, it's helping us understand our different soil patterns. If we came in here and forced a certain soil pattern or a certain access to the land or a certain type of layout of the land, we wouldn't got as good a results as we're getting today. And we're ultimately would not have that incremental growth in the soil. We would end up with a big clay mess that would require a lot of outside inputs. This garden space has near zero outside inputs other than seed and lime. The lime is primarily because we have a clay soil. But folks, if you got questions, put them in the comments below. If you think what I'm doing is dumb and doesn't make any sense, ask below. I've got my first YouTube troll, which is pretty exciting for me. But ultimately, I'm not claiming to be the expert in this, but for a temperate climate, we do know what we're doing, and we are getting a large amount of production for home use. We're not selling vegetables at the farmer's market, but we're also not buying in any fertilizer. We're using a minimal amount of petroleum, and we're covering quite a big garden, quite a big space. Now that we're renting out the equipment, because there's some fences going in and the equipment's being used, we'll actually make this even better. But the idea is to design out any equipment at all. Because yes, this space could easily be farmed. That tractor could easily till up all this land and get it farmed out. But what we'd end up with is a giant garden that was all dirt. We wouldn't have the access points. We wouldn't have the teaching nooks. We wouldn't have the variety of vegetables in here. We wouldn't have, some of the land would not be usable at all. Like there's a steep area over on the other side, and then this whole top edge would be really hard to use. We're able to get maximum use with minimum inputs. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. I'll see you in the next podcast, next video, blog. And of course, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to make custom videos to answer your specific needs and concerns. And I'm getting back to work.